I've changed the reading, the gospel reading for today. I want to do a reading that was my mother's favorite spiritual poem, which I last heard her read last year when I was in Ireland last year, when I was baptizing my great grandnephew, and she read this as her contribution and her wishes for him. You've heard it before many times probably. It's called Footprints in the Sand. One night I had a dream. I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord. Across the sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene, I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that many times along the path of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times in my life. This really bothered me. And I questioned the Lord about it. Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I have noticed that during the most troublesome times in my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you most, you would leave me. The Lord replied, "My precious child, I love you, and I would never leave you. During your times of trial and suffering, when there was only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you." A word inspired by God. She was a companion on the journey, officially. She's on Bob's list. And every time she was in town, she celebrated and attended all of our services. My mother, Peg, she and I were companions on the journey for much longer than that, going all the way back to 1946. So we were companions on the journey 51 years before COJ was founded. But she was a companion on the journey to many of you here as well. She wasn't just my companion on the journey. She was a companion on the journey to many of you. And often on a Sunday after Mass, I would ring her. So by the time I got back from Mass, typically it would be 2 o'clock my time, about 10 o'clock her time, and I'd talk to her. And she would always ask about COJ, and specific people whom she knew very well. She always asked about Nina, always about Kathleen Lyons, Brigitte, where's Brigitte? Margaret Park, Michael Choi, Maureen Ryan. She would name them out and ask about how they were doing each time. And so today, because you and I were companions on the journey with her, I want to share some stories about her life and her times and her gifts. She was born on the 11th of January in 1927, and her given name was Margaret Ellen Murphy. But her dad, my grandfather, Daddy Jim, when he was sent out about 5 or 6 days after the birth to register her birth, he met a few of his buddies on the road, and he told them that he was a new daddy. This was his first child. And so they figured out that was a cause for celebration. So they whisked him away to a pub, and about 8 hours later, he staggered down to the registrar's office, and he put on the wrong date and the wrong name. She's on the register as born on the 14th of January, although her mother always said it was the 11th. And instead of calling her Margaret Ellen O'Leary, he put down Margaret Eileen O'Leary. So her birth certificate has the wrong date and the wrong name. But apart from that, he was an extraordinary father to her. This Daddy Jim, whom I knew, he died in 1956. I've told you many times, he was the best storyteller I've ever come across in my life. Extraordinary storyteller. He was also a very gifted musician. He played the fiddle, he played the concert flute, he played the tin whistle, he played the squeeze box, he played the piano. He was a genius at music. And he was also an excellent Irish step dancer. In fact, for many years, he had his own school of Irish step dancing in Galway. And so my mother, as a little child, from the age of 3, she was dancing competitively in Irish step dancing. And she was a fabulous dancer, ballroom dancing, tango, anything what you want, right up to the very end. In fact, she danced for us here the last time we was here on carpet, which is very difficult to do Irish step dancing on carpet, but she did it the last time she was out here for her. Her mother was a real lady and couldn't get over the fact that she was raising a feisty Amazon. They were like chalk and cheese. My grandmother, Jane Graney, was a real gentle lady from County Galway, and my mother was a feisty Amazon who always had an opinion on everything. But her father probably had more of an influence on her life than her mother. She spent a lot of time with her father as a kind of an only child. And so he taught her many, many things, not just music and not just her step dancing, but he taught her about life as well. He taught her fierce independence of spirit. And I'd illustrate that with just a story about his life. Way back in the 1940s, when Ireland was very, very staunchly, traditionally Catholic, his best friend, my grandfather was a plater, so he made shovels in a furnace, stripped to the waist, in front of a furnace, turning shovels and pounding them with a big hammer. And at one stage, his best friend, who was a Protestant called Matty Porteous, died. And my grandfather went to the funeral in a Protestant church, which was totally verboten at the time, and went with the cortege to the graveyard and stepped inside a Protestant graveyard. And he was excommunicated for it. The local priest came down on horseback to the forge where my grandfather was working, leant down off horseback and looked into this hellhole with a furnace and my grandfather turning shovels, and he said, "James Murphy, I have news for you. When you and I die, we'll be going to different places." And my grandfather said, "Ken McCarthy, that's a great relief to hear it." He was a fiercely independent, and he passed that on to my mother. He also had a tremendous love for the underdog, which he passed on to Peg in spades. So she tells one story about, she's 13 years of age, they're in Cork City, they lived way out in Blarney. So when they went into the city, it was a big, big deal. And there was a big bus station in Cork City called the Bus Oris, and all the country buses would leave for there. So one evening, as my grandfather and herself are about to leave on the Blarney bus, they notice there's a beggar man sitting down with a cap in front of him trying to collect pennies, and he's scratching on a fiddle and he's destroying it. And my grandfather goes over to him and says, "Things aren't going so well." There was nothing inside in the cap. And so he says to my mother, "Peggy, stand out here." And he took the fiddle off your man and started playing jigs and reels and hornpipes and forced my mother, a 13-year-old teenager, to dance in public. And they made a small fortune for this beggar man. And then he handed him back his fiddle and got on the bus. So these were the lessons my mother learned at his knee. A fierce independence of spirit and an extraordinary love for the underdog. So the mother was the influence on her being a lady. It didn't work. The father was the influence on her being an Amazon with an extraordinary love for the poor, and that worked in spades. So the gifts that I really admired about my mother were those that she had courage like I've never witnessed in any other human being. I remember one incident, and it was Christmas Eve, 1957. So she would have been just 30 at the time. And she's down in Cork City shopping, and she's down in little back alleys trying to get bargains for stuff. And there was a fish shop on a little street called Robert Street, a very, very dark, dungeony street, no lighting whatsoever. And there was a blind balladeer, a man who used to stand outside the fish shop, and he had a sheaf of ballads. And he would sing a ballad, and then he would try to sell the sheet to the people who would be listening, a penny for a sheet. And he's singing his heart out, ballad after ballad, and as people are coming in over the chip shop, they're paying a penny for each of this. So there's a big crowd gathered round. So he finishes and he's putting his ballads away, and the crowd is melting, and all of a sudden, this huge big thug comes, pushed him over, grabbed the hat, and took off. And my mother took off after him, up these labyrinthine ways. And every so often, he'd turn around, and he'd glare at her, and she'd stop, and he'd turn and go and walk again, and she'd walk after him. And she followed him for an hour and a half. And finally, he went into a pub, and she sat outside the pub and waited. And about 2 hours later, he came out of the pub with another guy, bigger and meaner and uglier than himself. And she followed the two of them. And they walked the whole labyrinthine set of streets, and then they split up, and she followed the guy that she knew had done it. And after about 3 hours of this, she finally spotted 2 policemen, and she screamed at them. And they ran, and she told them what had happened. So they nabbed this guy, and they said, "We'll take him to the police station, but this guy has been arrested many times, but nobody will give evidence against him, because he intimidates them. Are you prepared to give evidence?" She said, "You better believe it." So they frog march your man to the jailhouse, and she's walking after him, kicking him in the arse every five or 6 minutes. Made her statement, and about 3 weeks later, she's at the bus queue, and she sees this guy coming up, looking intimidating. So he jumped out in front of him and said to the whole crowd, "This is the guy that beat up the blind balladeer." And the guy took off and wasn't seen since. So that was the kind of courage, extraordinary courage she had. She had a tremendous generosity of spirit and hospitality was very, very important to her. Nobody ever was denied food or a bed, no matter who they were. In the time I was growing up, there were 6 of us kids. There were our grandparents, there were our parents living in this small house, but there was always somebody else living with us. Very, very often, people who were in some way distressed or some physical impairment. We had blind people staying with us a lot. They came from a school, and when they came out of school and were looking for work, she'd give them hospitality, and they'd stay for 1.5 years or 2 years while they were working. So there was always a whole bunch of people passing through. Extraordinary generosity of spirit. She was also a brilliant storyteller in her own right, very different from my grandfather. My grandfather's stories were Irish mythology, great epics and sagas, the telling of any one of which would take maybe 3 or 4 nights. My mother Peg was different. She was Jerry Seinfeld 60 years before Jerry Seinfeld was, literally. She would take the most ordinary of circumstances, and to hear her telling it, it was absolutely hilarious. And she would end every story by saying, "Laugh, is it? I never laughed as much in my life." And mostly the joke was on herself. So for instance, at one stage, in her late 60s, she had to get hearing aids, and she hated these hearing aids. And she tells a story about the first time she wore the hearing aids and went into the bathroom and sat down and started her business. She said, it was like Niagara Falls. I got such a shock. I jumped up and I peed all over myself. So occasionally she'd refuse to wear these, and she'd put them in a box, and for months at a time she wouldn't wear them. But she was also really generous. She'd also always be trying to buy little gifts. She had 6 kids of her own, eventually 19 grandkids and 11 great-grandkids. And so she was always buying gifts that she'd store away for their birthdays or stuff like that. So on the birthday of one of her grandchildren, whose brothers are back there now, a girl called Martina. It was Martina's 21st birthday. So there's a big crowd of us inside in the house, and everybody's giving Martina particular kinds of gifts. And my mother goes upstairs, and she has a gift for Martina. She'd bought a set of earrings for Martina. She says them in a little box, and she comes down, and she presents them to Martina, and Martina opens it and says, and she's looking at her, and she says, what am I going to do with these? And Peg says, wear them in your ears. It was her hearing aids. So she was constantly the butt of her own jokes. I remember on another occasion, she's downtown in Cork City at a place called the Grand Parade, and it's a big main intersection, and she's window shopping. And she noticed that there's a lady, a blind lady with a white cane and dark glasses, standing near the intersection, and Peg is watching in the shop. She looks around, and the light goes green for this lady to cross, and she doesn't move. And it goes red, and it goes green again, and she doesn't move. So my mother figures out she's afraid. So the next time it goes green, she grabs her and runs her across the street. And the mother said, no, 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 no. She gets her to the other side, and the woman said, but I didn't want to cross, I was waiting for a friend of mine. So she would tell these kinds of stories constantly in which she was the butt of her own joke. She had an extraordinary sense of humour. On into middle age, she decided to go back to school. She was lucky enough, she had finished actually secondary school as a young girl, 17 or 18, but she'd never gone to college. So in her 60s and her 70s, on 3 different occasions, she went back to college to do 3 different degrees. She did the first degree in catechetics for 3 years, just for the sheer fun of learning theology. Never taught it subsequently. Then about 3 or 4 years later, she went back to college for a second time, and she did a business degree, including computers, and never used that. It was just for the sheer fun of being in school. And then she went back finally for another degree on social sciences. Again, something she would never use. So of the last 20 years of her life, most of it was spent in college, just for the sheer fun of learning. So she was a brilliant scholar in the sense that she was interested in everything. Her house is a house of, I would say at a conservative estimate, at least 10,000 books. They're everywhere, jam-packed everywhere. In fact, a few years ago when she got really ill, and my brother Seamus brought her downstairs and created a living area downstairs for her own bathroom and her own bedroom downstairs, I inherited her bedroom. Every time I would go home, she would say, that's your bedroom now. Unfortunately, apart from being able to just squeeze across to where the bed was, there was nothing I could use there. Every shelf was packed with books. Every closet was packed with stuff that she had bought. And so every time I went home, I had to live out of my suitcase anyway, in my room. So that was her scholarship. So she loved bargain hunting. And every time she came to the States particularly, she would grab a hold of Kathleen Lyons, and they'd go off to Goodwill or to Salvation Army. She called it Sally Ann. I remember one occasion, they started in San Carlos, one day in San Carlos, and hit every Goodwill and Salvation Army from San Carlos down the peninsula to Redwood City, Mountain View, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, ending up with Kathleen Lyons' own place in Mountain View. And she'd go into these shops and take a cup, with a price tag of 50 cents on it, and she'd spend a half an hour examining it with there cracks in it, and then she'd go up and she'd spend another half an hour bargaining to get it down to 25 cents, just for the sheer hell of bargaining. But she loved particularly pillows, cushions, sheets, blankets, eider-downs and stuff like that. And so she'd bring them home to my house then. I was living in Menlo Park at the time. So I remember one particular incident. She comes home with this neon-coloured pink cushion. And I said to her, Peg, what are you doing with that? She said, that's for you. I said, I don't think so. So she parked her pink neon cushion and spent the month with me, and then went home. And as soon as she went home, I went back down to the Goodwill and I gave it back in. I declared to God, if the year after she came back and went in, and it was still in there, I don't blame it. Who the hell is going to buy that? And she came back, she said, I'm delighted. I found a comrade, was the word she used. I found a comrade for your pink cushion. And she brought it to me again. So when she'd gone home the second time, I figured, I'm not going to risk this anymore. So I gave the pink neon cushion a Christian burial. Make sure it never happened again. So there's a huge big Salvation Army up in Healdsburg near where I live. It's a huge big lot, 6 or 7 acres. They sell cars there, they sell boats there, campers, all kinds of things. And every day she'd want to go down there and spend time. I'd have to drop her off and go back 4 or 5 hours later and pick her up. And she'd go through them item by item, just for the sheer heck of having a bargain. So that is who she was in her middle age. She was also a consummate traveller. She came to visit me in Kenya twice when I was in Kenya with my littlest sister, Dervla. And then after I got thrown out of Kenya in 1986, just to show them, for the sheer hell of showing them, she went back on her own. And she spent 3 months there working in safari clinics with sisters from Cork. But when she arrived in Nairobi airport, about a year after I'd been thrown out of the country, she stood in the airport, put her hands in the air, and she says, we're back. She came to the States many times, and her greatest regret was the last time she visited me was in October of 2008. And she had an incident on the airplane where she was really gasping for breath, but told nobody about it. She arrived off the plane. Finally, the last hour and a half, they had her on oxygen on the plane. And she arrived here, and she was just totally purple. So I brought her straight up to my house, to a doctor, and we had her on oxygen for the week. And then my sister-in-law came out and brought her back. But the thing that was really hurting her, 2 things. She never got to visit COJ in that final visit of hers. And secondly, she had an envelope with $1,050 specifically for buying stuff in Salvation Army and Goodwill, and she never got to spend it. And she never did spend it. And so in fact, when we went through her affairs after she had died, there is still an envelope with $1,050 brand new dollars. And she talked about it many times. That had never been sold. So her illness began to develop for the following reasons. She, from her 20s into her 50s, she smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Terrible smoker. And then she gave them up in her early 50s. And by profession, she was a seamstress. So she's constantly in an environment where there's fabric dust in the atmosphere. And so her lungs really paid the price. So she had a combination of conditions, COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and she had something which is called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and she also had coronary artery disease. So when these happened, she was given a prognosis of 3 years. That was 2002. And she beat the odds again, like Peg always beat the odds. But for the last few years, pretty much every winter, she got some kind of a really bad lung infection or pneumonia. And so in October of this year, she went into hospital with a combination of pneumonia, and then picked up some kind of a bug in the hospital, and then developed pleurisy. And they saw a spot in her lung at that stage, and they wanted to biopsy it and send her to Dublin. She says, that's it, no more treatment, that's it. I'm ready to go at this stage. I want to go back home, I want to be in my own house. And she did. And so she spent the last 6 or 7 weeks in her own home, independent in the sense that she still had oxygen. She was on oxygen 24/7 for the last 3 years of her life. But she had a backpack, and she would drive. And so she was driving 6 weeks before she died with this backpack of oxygen and carrying it around with her. Fiercely independent right up to the end. And so I was intending to go home on the 22nd of November because I realized that, she probably wasn't going to see Christmas. And then, as you remember, on the 14th of November, early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call from my brother saying that she was really in a bad way. And so after the children's mass that Sunday, I left for Ireland. And I arrived in Cork at 5 p.m. I arrived home in her house at 5 p.m. on Monday evening, and she was really delighted to see me. She kept repeating, "You came back, you came back, you came back, you came back." So apart from a small siesta in the middle of it, I spent the last 44 hours of her life with her. There was a whole gang of us. She had, as I told you, she had 6 kids, but one of my sisters died in 1995 of a brain aneurysm. The other 5 were there. 16 of her 19 grandchildren were there. Her 11 great-grandchildren all paid a visit during this period of time. So a typical scene was 10 or 12 of us sitting on the bed, lying on the bed, around the bed with her, talking to her, telling her stories, singing songs to her. And for that period of time, most of it she was conscious, but she was only interactive with her eyes. She wasn't talking a whole lot, very little energy to speak. But her eyes were saying everything. But we sang to her, we told her stories, we reminded her of events for her own life. And then there was somebody stayed with her round the clock. So I stayed with her all the time. My brother Seamus stayed, and then there were other people who came and went over the 44 hours. For the last, from 3:30 in the morning on the 17th, I noticed that her breathing was getting really, really shallow and a bit laboured. And so we began to congregate, and by 7:30 there was 12 of us in the room sitting on the bed with her, and I was leading her through the process of the dying, reminding her just to keep watching for the light and not to get distracted by what her body was doing or the kind of the illusions. Kept leading her through it, and she kept nodding in response to kind of what I was saying to her. And then she fell asleep for a few hours, and then she woke up very, very near the end, and she was a little bit agitated, and she sat up in the bed, and I grabbed her, and somebody else, Aisling, sat in beside her. And all of a sudden she looked up to her left, and she saw something up there, and I have never in my life seen somebody with so much awe and so much wonder and so much incredulity in her face. Whatever she saw up there. It was the light, obviously, or it was my sister Ethna coming to escort her home. But there was this transfixed look of, oh my God, I can't believe what I'm just seeing now. And at that stage, I kind of just eased her back down. Aisling was behind her, and she took 3 or 4 breaths, and she went. Yeah. So after a few minutes, Seamus, my brother, took the tube out of her nose, the air tube, and turned off the machine. And I suddenly realized the extraordinary silence. When these machines, they go non-stop. So this was her life for the last 8 years. Suddenly there was this extraordinary silence. I had never in my life heard my mother silent. When she was awake, she was talking, and when she was asleep, she was snoring. So she was never silent. But there was this extraordinary silence ensued. And we sat around just waiting with her. So then people began to, do various tasks. So I lay beside her for an hour after she died, cheek to cheek, turned off all the lights in the room, and just imagined what her journey was like at this stage of the safari, and tried to, insofar as I could, escort her on that final phase of the transition into the afterlife. We kept her at home. We called the funeral people. They came. They took her for 4 hours and embalmed the body, and then brought her home. And we waked her for 3 days. So she's lying in state in her own bed, not in the coffin, in her own bed. And the girls had done a beautiful job in the room. There was flowers there was incense burning, there were candles all over. And for the next 60 hours, we escorted her. We told stories about her, we sang songs to her, and there was probably never less than 7 or 8 people in the room for the entirety of that time. And then on Saturday morning, the 20th, about 10 o'clock in the morning, we had a final family farewell to her. And then the coffin came in and she was brought to the church, and we had a mass at noon in which all of her children, all of her grandchildren, and most of her great-grandchildren participated, either as readers, as singers. Her granddaughter, Dawn, Sean Seamus' sister, is a brilliant musician. She sang the mass, accompanied by an uncle of ours, Dan O'Leary. So people were either reading or singing or doing eulogies or offering prayers of petition or carrying up the gifts, but everybody of the family was involved. And it was a typical, COJ mass, 2 hours in extension. And then we took her to the graveyard and we buried her for the last time. And so, to finish up, what I would like to do, Peg was a woman who lived life to the full. She took life very seriously in the sense that it was meant to be lived completely. But a seriousness always tempered by the ability to laugh at life and to laugh with life. Serious only in the sense that it was meant to be lived in completely, but not in the sense that it was meant to be lived with long faces. And so one of the songs I sang for her at the very end was her own favourite song. It was her party piece. And to show that even in the transitioning, that life is to be laughed with and laughed at, I want to end my homage to my mother this morning by singing her favourite song. And it's a funny one, as you can imagine, because that's how she wanted to be remembered. And it goes like this. There once was a farmer who took a young miss way back of a barn where he gave her a lecture on horses and cattle and eggs, and told her that she had such beautiful manners which suited a girl of her charms, a girl that he wanted to take in his washing and ironing, and then if she did, they would get married and raise up some sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. The maid told the farmer that he'd better stop, or she'd call her father, and he called a taxi and got there before very long. Someone was doing his little girl a right for a change, and so that's why he said, if you marry her, son, you're better off single, 'cause it's always been my belief marriage can bring a man nothing but sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. The farmer decided to wed anyway and started preparing for his wedding suit, which he purchased for only $1. Then he discovered he was out of money, and so he was left in the lurch, standing and waiting in front of the end of the story, which just goes to show all a girl wants from a man are his sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. Oh. Peg, my mother, who gave me the spacesuit for this incarnation, I honor you. I thank you for what you've modeled to me. Namaste.